Welcome to the Commander Crew, a Magic the Gathering Commander YouTube channel where we ask the question, who's your commander?
We want to thank you for watching our videos. You can help support us by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and hitting the bell notification icon.
You can also go to thecommandercrew.com to check out our t-shirts, masks, pet hoodies, and other Commander Crew goodies.
If you want to buy any of the cards seen in this video, be sure to click our TCG Player affiliate link in the show notes below.
Lastly, you can help us out by heading to our official Patreon page and becoming a direct supporter of the channel. Now let's
get to the
video.
What's up, everyone? It's your boy Eddie from the Commander Crew, and today we are doing a deck tech on Esika, God of the Tree. Esika, God of the Tree is a 1/4 legendary god that costs 1 green, and it has Vigilance and tap to add 1 mana of any color. It also has other legendary creatures you control have Vigilance and tap to add 1 mana of any color. This is also a modal double face card, and on the back side we have the Prismatic Bridge, which costs Wooburg for a legendary enchantment that reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature or planeswalker card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I'm really excited about this one here. I will tell you that we're playing it more for the enchantment side than anything. And why I'm so excited is because I'm building something that I believe is different than pretty much any other Esika deck that I've seen. And what makes this deck so much different is most of the Esika decks that I'm seeing are either God Tribal or they're Super Friends decks. So either 5-color gods or 5-color Super Friends decks. And I understand why people are building those, and those definitely seem very fun. But in my case, I wanted to build something that allowed me to play around with commanders that I've always wanted to either build around or I have built around and I really enjoy playing them. So I built this deck with that in mind. So this is Legendary Tribal, or in my case, Commander Tribal. So let's kick things off with Ramp. So first off, we have Animar, Soul of Elements. Animar, Soul of Elements costs blue, red, green for a 1/1 Legendary Elemental. Has protection from white and black, and whenever you cast a creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on Animar. It also has creatures that you cast cost 1 less for each 1/1 counter on Animar. So Animar is a deck that I've always wanted to build around, and the fact that this deck is so creature heavy means that Animar gets to reduce the cost on a lot of our spells. In fact, in this particular deck, we have 36 creatures. So this is absolutely amazing, definitely a lot of fun. And to go alongside it, because of Esika, when we have Esika on the battlefield, we can actually tap Animar to add 1 mana of any color, in addition to it reducing the casting cost of these spells. Next up, we have Arcane Signet, which we all know what this does. It's a commander staple at this point. We have Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, another commander that I'm really excited to play with. I've always wanted to build an Ashaya deck since it came out, and actually since I started seeing Corey use his. So Ashaya costs 3 green, and it says Ashaya's power and toughness are equal to the amount of lands that you control, and non-token creatures that you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. So what's really cool about this is it's almost as good as having Esika on the battlefield. Don't get me wrong, Esika can have these cards, all of our creatures, tap for any color, while Ashaya is only gonna allow them to tap for green. But the fact that we're turning all our creatures into mana is the part that's important, and the part that's going to help us to ramp out very quickly and generate a lot of mana and be able to cast more of those creature spells. Next up, we have Farseek, which is going to help us to put a land out on the battlefield. We have Felwar Stone, which is a mana rock that's going to help us to ramp 1 mana. We have Goreclaw, Terra of Qualsisma. I hope I pronounced that right. Goreclaw costs 3 a green for a 4/4/3 legendary bear, and it says creature spells that you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast, and whenever Goreclaw attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So this card is great for a few reasons. It's a legendary creature, so it's going to tap to add 1 mana of any color when Esika's on the battlefield. It's going to help us to reduce the casting cost of our creature spells by 2, as long as they have power 4 or greater, which is amazing in this deck. And lastly, it's going to give any of our creatures that have power 4 or greater +1/+1 in trample. That's something that can help us to take out a player. Next up, we have Karametra. Karametra I run in my Tulane deck, and she is a lot of fun to play with. She helps to ramp us out very quickly every time we cast a creature spell. Like I said, there's 36 of those in this deck, so that's going to be happening a lot. Next up, we have Mox Amber, which is a great card for our legendary tribal deck because it's going to add 1 mana of any color among legendary creatures and planeswalkers that we control. Now in this deck, we're not running any planeswalkers, but we do have quite a few legendary creatures, so this is going to matter quite often. Next up, we have Nature's Lore, which is going to bring a forest onto the battlefield for us. We have Rampant Growth, which is going to put a basic land onto the battlefield for us. We have Sakura Tribe Elder, which is going to put a basic land onto the battlefield for us. We have Soul Ring, which is going to tap for 2 colorless mana. We have 3 Visits, which is a second Nature's Lore in this deck. We have Umora, the Collector, which is going to help to reduce the casting cost of any of our creatures in this deck. And after that, we have some color fixing. So we have Gigantha, the Wellspring, which is going to tap to add Wooburg to our mana pool, and we can use this to pay for any colored mana. We have Joda, which is going to make it so that we can cast any of our spells for Wooburg. So anything that costs an extravagant amount of mana, we can literally just pay Wooburg for, and that's going to help us to not only cast our spells more easily, but also to cast our spells for cheaper in some cases. Joda is also a deck that I've always wanted to build, and being able to utilize Joda in this deck is definitely a lot of fun. Then we have Ramos. Corey also has a Ramos deck, and I've always wanted to build around that just for the really quick and easy ways of manipulating counters and being able to ramp out spells much more quickly. Ramos in this deck isn't going to do it as quickly as if we were building completely around Ramos, but we are going to be casting a lot of spells in this deck, and being able to have Ramos on the battlefield, we should be able to get to those 5 counters fairly quickly, and that will ramp us out to 10 mana. Next up, we have the World Tree, which is a land that enters the battlefield tapped, can tap for green mana, and as long as you have 6 or more lands that you control have tap to add 1 mana of any color. You can also pay 10 mana in Wooburg style, so double white, double blue, double black, double red, double green, to sacrifice the World Tree and search your library for any number of god cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. I believe that this card is the main reason that a lot of people are building that god tribal deck, but here in this deck, we're mainly using it just for that color fixing, being able to tap our lands to add 1 mana of any color, as opposed to adding whatever color that they're supposed to add to your mana pool, is very strong, and it's going to help us to fix our mana and tap for the stuff that we need. Next up, we have card draw. So first up, we have Beast Whisperer. Beast Whisperer will draw you a card every time you cast a creature. We have Consecrated Sphinx, which will draw you 2 cards every time an opponent draws a card. We have Afara, which is going to draw you a card as long as a creature entered the battlefield under your control the previous turn. Guardian Project, which is going to draw you a card every time a creature enters the battlefield. Joyra, which is going to draw you a card for every artifact, legendary, and saga that we cast. Mystic Remora, which is going to draw us a card every time an opponent casts a non-creature spell, as long as they don't pay an additional 4 mana. Phyrexian Arena, which is going to draw us a card at the beginning of our upkeep. We also lose a life, but in Commander, that's not a big deal. Pull from Tomorrow, which is one of my all-time favorite card draw spells, because this spell is going to draw us pretty much as many cards as we want, or as many cards as we can generate mana for, at instant speed, so we can do this at the end of one of our opponent's turns. And we only have to discard 1 card. That's not much of a drawback for this spell. So this card is really amazing, and if you're running blue, you should probably be running this spell. We have Reki, which is going to draw us a card every time we cast a legendary spell. We have Rhystic Study, which is going to draw us a card every time an opponent casts a spell, unless they pay 1 mana. We have Stroke of Genius, which is like a Pull from Tomorrow, but you're paying 1 extra mana for it, and you don't have to discard a card. We have Sylvan Library, which says, at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put that card back on top of your library. We have Tatiova, which is going to draw us a card every time a land enters the battlefield. And lastly, we have Windfall, which again, this is another card that should pretty much be played in any deck that's running blue. It's easy to cast, even in multicolor decks like this one. Next up, we have a category called Extra Upkeeps, and basically with the Prismatic Bridge on the battlefield, so the backside of Esika, we want to try to make that trigger as many times as possible. So we have 2 cards that help us to do that. We have Paradox Haze, which is going to repeat our upkeep, and then we have Sphinx of the Second Sun, which is going to repeat our beginning phase, which also means it helps us to draw an additional card. Now, Sphinx of the Second Sun is definitely a little bit more on the expensive side, but in this deck we are ramping out pretty quickly, and we have cards like Joda that can help us to cast these spells really easily and really quickly. Next up, we have our tutors. So we're tutoring with Captain Sisay, which will let us tap to search for a legend or legendary card, reveal that card and put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. We have Sidisi, which will allow us to exploit either himself or another card and search our library for a card and put it into our hand. And lastly, we have Sisay, Weatherlight Captain, which is a commander that I've always wanted to build around. This card allows us to pay Wooburg and search our library for a legendary permanent with converted mana cost less than Sisay's power. So Sisay's power is going to increase based on the amount of colors of other legendary permanents that we have. So we can search our library for these cards and put them right out onto the battlefield, which is absolutely amazing. It's a way of paying Wooburg for any legendary permanent in our deck. Next up, we have Feldon of the Third Path. Again, another commander that I would love to build around. With this here, with all those legendary creatures coming out onto the battlefield, eventually some of them are going to die. Some of them are going to get sent to the graveyard. And Feldon is going to be a way of recurring some of those creatures, putting them back out onto the battlefield for a turn. And it's only going to cost us 3 mana to do that. This card is fantastic. We also have the Scarab God, which does a similar effect. It will allow us to exile one of those creature cards from our graveyard and create a 4/4 token copy of it. That's also a black zombie. The Scarab God is also very difficult to get rid of, which is something that I really love about it. I have a Scarab God deck. I have a few of them actually. And Scarab God is always a ton of fun to build around, whether you're building a zombie tribal deck or just a toolbox strategy, which is probably my favorite way to build around him. Scarab God is truly amazing. So next up we have Kodama of the East Tree, which is an amazing card that I've been wanting to build around ever since its release in Commander Legends fairly recently. So this card basically says that anytime we put a permanent onto the battlefield, as long as he's out, anytime we put a permanent onto the battlefield, we can take another permanent from our hand as long as it costs either the same or less converted mana costs and throw it right onto the battlefield. So this is a way to get free creatures and other permanents right out onto the battlefield just for casting our spells. So in the case of, let's say, the Scarab God, we play the Scarab God, he costs 5 mana. Now we can take any card in our hand that costs 5 or less, including lands, and put it right out onto the battlefield. This card is amazing. Next up, we have Maelstrom Wanderer. So Maelstrom Wanderer is an 8 casting cost card, but this is yet another commander that I've been wanting to build around. It's got Cascade, which is crazy. So we cast the spell for 8 mana, and the next spell that we reveal off the top of our library, as long as it's a non-land spell, we get to cast it. And then we get to do that a second time because it's Cascade. So this card is terrific, especially in this deck. There's pretty much nothing in this deck that is going to cost more than 8 mana. So pretty much the next spell that we reveal, that's a non-land of course, we're going to be able to cast. Next up, we have AC, Tyrant of the Gyre Strait. So with this card right here, it's going to allow us to not only ramp, it's also going to allow us to draw a lot of cards. So it reads that we can play additional lands on each of our turns, but it also reads that when a land enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. Next up, we have Chromatic Lantern, that not only is going to help us to ramp by adding 1 mana of any color, but it's also going to do the same effect that the World Tree has, which is it's going to allow us to tap our lands for 1 mana of any color. Then we have Chromatic Ori, which costs 7 mana, so it's a very expensive spell, but We're going to be able to spend mana as though it were mana of any color, so again, color fixing. We're going to be able to ramp by tapping it to add 5 mana to our mana pool. And then lastly, we can pay 5 mana, tap it, and draw a card for each color among permanents we control, which just by having Prismatic Bridge out, we're going to be able to pay 5 mana, tap this, and draw 5 cards. That's absolutely amazing. This is a must-have in most 5-color decks, and we're a deck that will be able to ramp out very quickly to be able to cast this pretty easily. Next up, we have one of my all-time favorite commanders. I love using this deck. Most people don't like when I use it, but it is extremely fun. This is Tulane. So Tulane is going to allow us to draw a card every time we cast a creature spell, and then we can actually take a land from our hand and throw it onto the battlefield, which is amazing. And as if that all wasn't enough, he also allows us to pay 3 and return target creature that we control back to our hand. So he has built-in protection to not only protect himself, but any other creature that we have on the battlefield that our opponent might be trying to get rid of. Next up, we have Dryad of the Elysian Grove, which allows us to not only play an additional land and ramp off of him, but we can also tap our lands for pretty much any color in addition to what they already tapped for. Next up, we have Golos, which again, this is another deck that I've always wanted to build around. I've seen both Corey and Chris build around this commander, and he's a commander that not only helps you to ramp, but also for the cheap cost of 7 mana, you can exile 3 cards from the top of your library and you can play them without paying their mana cost. So in this deck, you're not going to get as much value off of Golos as you would if you built completely around Golos, right? Because you can play spells that cost more than the 7 mana that you're going to have to pay to exile those top 3 cards. We're also not playing a lot of top deck manipulation, but we do have a lot of high costing spells in this deck. We do have a lot of high costing creatures in this deck. Being able to play 3 of those spells for 7 mana is typically going to be worth it in this deck. It's not often that you're going to whiff. Next up, we have Kenrith, the Return King. I've seen this deck played not only by Mitch from Commander's Quarters, but also by Chris from the Commander Crew from our channel. And Chris's deck with Kenrith is really fun, really cool looking. I love all the abilities that come along with this, with giving your creatures haste and trample, with pumping up a creature, with gaining life, drawing a card, or with just returning a creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield. This card is pretty much a machine. We can use it for whatever we need in the moment that we need it, and we can use all of these abilities at instant speed. This card is absolutely amazing. I've always wanted to build a deck around it, and being able to throw him into this is going to be a lot of fun. Next up, we have Kethis. So Kethis is kind of the reason that I built this deck. I've always wanted to build a legendary tribal deck, especially after I saw Josh playing with this, but I never took the time to put a deck together around this. In addition to that, the fact that it's only Abzan and it excludes so many commanders that I would want to play with wasn't really something that I was all in for. I believe that 5 color is definitely the way to go with this style of deck, and I'm really excited to run this in it. Now, Kethis in particular does a couple of things that's going to be extremely beneficial for this deck. Not only does he reduce the casting cost of all our legendary spells, but he also can exile 2 legendary cards from our graveyard, and we'll be able to cast legendary spells from our graveyard until end of turn. Next up, we have Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. So this is another deck that I've always wanted to build. Not only does he help you to ramp by making all your non-land permanents tap for additional mana, but also he can help you to kind of do that Golos thing where you can play cards off of the top of your library as long as they're non-human creature cards. So I've always wanted to build Kinnan. The problem is when you focus so heavily on a deck like Kinnan or Golos, it becomes too powerful, and then you have players around you within your play group that just don't want to play against that deck. So you end up spending all this money, investing all this time into building a deck that other people don't want to see and don't want to see you play. So I've never bothered investing the time into building this deck, but being able to throw them into the deck here, into this Esika deck, it's going to be a lot of fun to play around with. It's going to help us to ramp, and we're going to be able to cast spells for the 7 mana that it takes to cast spells for using his ability. Next up, we have Nylea, which is going to be a card that helps us to reduce the casting cost of our creature spells, but also we can reveal cards from the top of our library, and if it's a creature, we can put them into our hands. So we basically have a way to not only help reduce the casting cost of some of our creature spells, but also to be able to draw creature spells off the top of our library. Next up, we have Thrasios. So I used to have a competitive deck that was built around Thrasios and pretty much playing out my entire deck, and I loved it. I absolutely love playing with Thrasios. He's a way that we can not only put lands onto the battlefield, but we can also draw cards off of him. He has the ability to scry first so that you can try to make sure that you're getting the spell that you want, or the card that you want rather. Thrasios is just an absolute machine, and this is something that's a must-have in this deck for sure. Next up, we have Zakama. So Zakama is something that I've always wanted to build around. I love the fact that he untaps your lands when he enters the battlefield. He is a monster of a commander. He does cost a lot at 9 mana. He is definitely the most expensive card in our deck, but that ability to untap all our lands is abusable. And in addition to that, he's a toolbox of a commander where we can use him to either gain life, deal damage to target creatures, or destroy an artifact or enchantment. He is a must-have in this deck. He is a commander that I've always wanted to build around, so I definitely threw him in here because, like I said, I've always wanted to build around him. Speaking of abusing cards like Zakama, next up we have our clones. So we have the 2 Sakashimas. It's getting to the point where anytime I'm running blue, if I'm building a deck around my commander, having somebody like Sakashima of 1,000 Faces and Sakashima the Imposter are must-haves in the deck. These cards, both Sakashimas, are just amazing to have when you're running so many legendary creatures. So being able to copy those legendary creatures and not have any of them leave the battlefield because of the legend rule, because both Sakashimas get around them, is just incredible. So you can have multiples of whatever card it is that you want on the battlefield, as long as you already have one to begin with. And having these clones to do that is just very dangerous for your opponents to allow to happen. And yeah, these cards are must includes. Next up, we have removal. So we have 9 removal spells in here. We have Anguished Unmaking, we have Assassin's Trophy, Beast Within, Despark, Generous Gift, Nature's Claim, Path to Exile, Swan Song, and Swords to Plowshares. These are pretty much the best removal spells in my opinion for a 5-color deck, and I don't see a reason not to play every single one of them. Last up, we have our lands, our mana base. These are tricky. So in a 5-color mana base, it's definitely a difficult thing to build around. Luckily, with all our color fixing, we shouldn't run into too much trouble with trying to cast our spells, but we want to make sure that we can get the lands that we need when we need them. So you're going to notice there are a ton of fetch lands in this deck. So in this package, we have Arid Mesa, of course, one of the normal fetch lands. We have Blood Crypt, Bloodstained Mire, Breeding Pool, City of Brass, Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, Flooded Strand. We run 4 forests, Godless Shrine, Hallowed Fountain, 3 islands, Mana Confluence, Marsh Flats, Misty Rainforest, a mountain, Overgrown Tomb, a plains, Polluted Delta, Reflecting Pool, Sacred Foundry, Scalding Tarn, Steam Vents, Stomping Ground, a swamp, Temple Garden, Verdant Catacombs, Watergrave, Windswept Heath, and Wooded Foothills. So like I said, a lot of shocklands, a lot of fetch lands. This is what I feel we need to make this deck work, but you can definitely run it with tapped fetch lands. It's just going to run a little bit slower because they come in tapped first. Not a huge deal, but definitely something to keep in mind when you're building this deck. There is going to be a pretty large expense when it comes to that mana base if you build it like I did. So that is our Esika deck. So take a look at this deck list. Any changes that you would make, let us know about them down in the comments. Be sure to subscribe, be sure to hit that bell notification, and until next time, take care.